I yield to the senator from Oregon for a question without yielding control of the floor.
I thank my colleague, and I want to thank him and Senator Booker and Senator Blumenthal for what they've done today. And here's the bottom line for me, Senator Murphy and colleagues. Mass shootings are now happening like clockwork in America. Thurston, Columbine, Blacksburg, Tucson, Newtown, Aurora, Charleston, Roseburg, and Orlando. Communities being torn apart by unspeakable gun violence, like clockwork. In this building, we come together now for moments of silence, honoring the victims of these shootings, like clockwork. And like clockwork, this Congress does nothing about it. When I was home last month, I visited at Umpqua Community College, just outside of Roseburg, which was the site of a horrendous shooting 8 months ago, one of the deadliest school shootings in our nation's history. What I saw at Umpqua Community College, what I heard from those at the school and the families at the community, is I'm sure a lot like what my friend from Connecticut hears about how the suffering doesn't go away. The one-year anniversary of the shooting in Charleston, South Carolina is coming up soon. I'm quite sure it's the same way for people in South Carolina. The trauma, the process of mourning, rebuilding, and then trying to find a way somehow, some way, to just be able to move forward from the enveloping grief. It's a horrendous experience, and a common experience now that so many of our communities share. And the reality is, the trauma doesn't just vanish into the vapor. The news cameras are eventually going to leave Orlando, just like they left Roseburg. The bullet holes in the nightclub get patched up. The families and the friends of the victims try to live their lives as best they can, and it's going to be such a difficult task for the LGBTQ community in Orlando. But the trauma isn't vanishing. So there's no perfect solution, but trauma ought to be followed up in a very concrete way with some specific, constructive steps that begin to lay out an answer. It just seems to me that the Senate and the Congress, the idea of following up with more moments of silence, with more inaction, just isn't enough. They're common steps, practical steps that the Congress can take now. Those who've argued that the only possible response to the shooting in Orlando can come in a war zone thousands of miles away are looking for excuses not to do something meaningful here at home. There are steps that can be taken now to curb this violence. They won't stop every crime. A number of the ideas have been discussed before. But the victims of the shooting are owed a response. First, I know my colleagues have mentioned this afternoon, Senator Feinstein has put forward a proposal to close the dangerous terrorist gun loophole. I've thought that was a sensible step. Common sense. People shouldn't look at that as a partisan issue. Americans want to know why anybody would vote to allow individuals suspected of terrorist ties and motivations to purchase regulated firearms. Next, close the loopholes in the background checks. It is way past time to do that and stop allowing the purchase of a gun online or at a gun show without a background check. Certainly, the background checks themselves have to be substantially improved. There are holes that ought to be plugged, including those that keep guns in the hands of somebody who's been a convicted domestic abuser. We're not talking about a charge. We're not something that's speculative. We're talking about a convicted domestic abuser. And once and for all, the Congress ought to close the pipeline for illegal guns, straw purchases, gun trafficking. These ought to be federal crimes. The Senator from Connecticut and I have also been strong advocates of beefing up the research into gun violence. There's been a prohibition on doing that. Say that one to yourself. A prohibition on doing research into gun violence just defies common sense. So it makes no sense at all to block the Centers for Disease Control from gathering information that can help our communities and our families be safe. And I'm just going to wrap up by getting personal for a moment. My late brother suffered from serious mental illness. Senator Murphy, not a day went by when I wasn't worried that my brother, who was a schizophrenic, would be out on the streets and he would either hurt himself or he'd hurt somebody else. And that was the case with my family. It is time to establish once and for all a system through which individuals who are found to be a potential threat to themselves or others can get the treatment they need. And I see my colleague from Michigan, here, who has championed this effort year after year after year. So I'm not going to recap the proposals. Some of them have been discussed at length here on the floor. But a majority of Americans find these kinds of common sense gun safety measures not to be ones that infringe on the rights of responsible gun owners or violate the Second Amendment or even come close to it. A majority of gun owners think that these proposals make sense. So what I would like to ask my colleague from Connecticut in terms of really an update, because my colleague from Connecticut has been a leader in this effort. Senator Feinstein's proposal, of course, is designed to prevent those on the watch list from buying a gun. Numbers have been thrown around repeatedly about the number of people this would actually impact. And I know that the General Accounting Office has looked into this. And can you tell me how many people on this watch list have been able to buy a gun?
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator Wyden, for the question. It's a really important one because the number is, in certain ways, shocking for how high it is and how low it is at the same time. Let's take 2015. In 2015, there were 244 individuals who were on the terrorist watch list who attempted to buy weapons. 223 of those were successful in buying the weapon. So in 90% of the occasions in which someone on the terrorist watch list attempted to buy a weapon, they walked out of that store with the weapon. Now, it gives you a sense of the scope of this. There's only 224 people over the course of the whole year that were on the terrorist watch list that attempted to buy a weapon. But what we know from this weekend is that it only takes one with malevolent intentions in order to create a path of death and destruction that is almost impossible to calculate. And it is just impossible for the American public to understand how that number persists, how we allow for 90% of the people on that watch list to walk into a store and to successfully buy a weapon. That's the number from 2015. 223 out of 244, they were successful, yielding the floor for a question.
I thank my colleague, and I'll just wrap up by way of saying that It seems to me that what has been learned here is that while the investigation goes on, there may have been a terrorist attack, there may have been an hate-inspired attack. My question is, aren't the steps that I've outlined here today common sense, practical steps, whether it is a hate-inspired attack, and we've seen the human toll that discrimination takes against those who are targeted on the basis of hate. We've seen what it means to families who've been struck by terror. But aren't the steps that have been outlined here by you and colleagues on the floor, Senator Casey's very valuable proposal, aren't these common sense legislative efforts that make sense whether this has been primarily a terror attack or a hate-inspired attack?
I thank the gentleman for the question. Of course, they are common sense measures, and importantly, they are measures that are supported by the broad cross-section of the American public. What you are proposing is only controversial here in the United States Senate. It is controversial nowhere else in this country.
I see colleagues waiting. I thank them for their courtesy.
I yield to the senator.